On March 21st, 2009, Ring of Honor presented its 7th anniversary show. In the main event on that night, the dominant world champion Nigel McGuinness, who at that point had held the championship for 532 days, defended against an international star on the rise, known as Kenta. Nigel first won the Ring of Honor World Championship on October 6, 2007 at Undeniable, becoming the 10th man to hold the title by besting Takeshi Morishima. Over the next 17 months he would defend the title 38 times, which puts him tied for the most Ring of Honor World title defenses ever, the other man to achieve this record being Bryan Danielson. Nigel would defend against many future stars, future Ring of Honor champions like Jay Briscoe and Claudio Castagnoli, future Impact World champions like Austin Aries, and even against future WWE champions such as Bryan Danielson and Seth Rollins, amongst many others. The story being told was that Nigel seemed to only get better and stronger with each and every defense, but one day that would have to come to an end. On the 20th of March 2009, one day before the title defense against Kenta, Nigel would compete in a main event tag team match, in which he would team with Davey Richards, who at this point was working his way up the card, to take on Kenta and El Generico. What happened to him exactly I'm not sure, but this wasn't Nigel's night at all, as not only was he pinned by Kenta following a go to sleep, but by the end of the match it was clear that he was struggling to get through it. That night, the Wrestling Observer would report that Nigel had suffered a serious injury, bad enough to require surgery, with the Figure 4 newsletter and other sources claiming he had torn both of his biceps. Despite these injuries, Nigel had 2 scheduled world title defenses booked, the following night against Kenta, and 2 weeks later against Jerry Lynn, and he was hell-bent on making both of those defenses. This was a very risky decision for Nigel, as not only does a bicep tear cause excruciating pain, but also reduces your strength by about 30 to 40%. Thanks, Dr. Google. Add to this, most of Nigel's key offense heavily relied on the use of his arms. Multiple variations of uppercuts and lariats, the Tower of London, and his London Dungeon submission. All of these moves would put more pressure on his already injured arms. Let's take a look at where Kenta was in his career at the time. Having debuted in 2000, initially for All Japan Pro Wrestling, Kenta would soon switch over to Pro Wrestling Noah when it was formed a month later. From here, Kenta would rise up the ranks and gain international attention. At the time of the match with Nigel, he had already won his 3rd GHC Junior Heavyweight Championship, and had already won awards for his team with another future star, Naomichi Marufuji, and had twice won the Observer's Move of the Year award for a famous move he invented, the Go to Sleep, which he's not at all bitter about anybody else using. Nope, not at all. In the future, Kenta would go on to win the GHC Heavyweight title and would hold it for almost a year. To win that title, he would also beat Takeshi Morishima, the same man Nigel beat for his world title. He would also win various tournaments in Noah before signing with WWE in July of 2014. Weirdly, Kenta would sign his contract inside the WWE ring at an event in Osaka, Japan, in a segment hosted by, of all people, Hulk Hogan and Jimmy Hart. Although maybe it's not so strange given that Hogan did have a history of wrestling in Japan, so was known in the country, but the visual is still weird looking. Kenta would debut in NXT in September of 2014, adopting the name Hideo Itami. According to Kenta himself, he chose the name because it means Hero of Pain. After leaving WWE in February of 2019, he would describe his time there as the most frustrating days of his life. In June 2019, he would join New Japan Pro Wrestling, where he still wrestles to this day, as a member of the Bullet Club, and at the time of me writing this, is the current Strong Openweight Champion. On the night of Kenta's challenge for the Ring of Honor World title, he will be greeted by the Hammerstein Ballroom crowd with respect. As was common in ROH at the time, fans would throw streamers into the ring to show respect for their favourite wrestlers. The tradition of fans throwing streamers at the wrestlers actually began in Japan, and I went into more detail about this custom in my last video if you're interested. As direct opposition to this respect, Nigel would enter cocky as ever, wearing the Ring of Honor World title backwards, as he often did. Why did Nigel do this? Well, in his own words, so you know who the champion is when you kiss my ass. Nigel also received a few streamers, having earned the respect of some of the fans during his reign, but clearly there were cracks in his armour to be seen when he took off his ring jacket, revealing bandages and tape on both of his arms, and the grimace on his face as he raised his jacket over the top rope. It was clear that this wasn't going to be the same unstoppable McGuinness we'd seen for so long. Right after the opening bell, the commentators Dave Prazak and Lenny Leonard make us aware right away that Nigel is hurt, with Prazak going as far to call him a man without arms. They go on to note that he tore his left bicep the previous night, but tore the right one some time ago, so he'd been working through injuries for a while. When Kenta was in WWE, they would often use the phrase, "his style is kick," to describe his offense, and this meant horrible news for Nigel, as minutes into the match, Kenta delivers brutal looking kicks right to Nigel's bandaged arm. The arrogant Nigel we were used to seeing had quickly gone away, as the injured champion was showing something we'd never seen in his previous 37 defences: weakness. In fact, it's rare to ever see a world champion show quite so much weakness in a title defence, in which Nigel was audibly whining in pain, even begging please no at some points. Kenta had complete control for the first several minutes, until Nigel managed to hit the Tower of London to the floor outside the ring. This gave McGuinness an opening, and the match became far more back and forth from here. But Kenta continues to focus on Nigel's left arm, with Nigel even hurting himself to do some of his trademark moves, such as his upwards kick into a downward lariat. Notably, as the match progresses, Nigel goes for many of his signature lariats, but misses every time. Maybe so the crowd can see them, but he doesn't risk further injury. Astonishingly, despite Nigel's injuries, this match lasted 25 minutes, and Nigel somehow wins with a variation of the London Dungeon, with his knees digging into Kenta's back. It would have been so easy for Kenta to lose this match to such a prone champion and look weaker by the end of it, but Nigel takes enough from Kenta to make him look like a star. But Kenta endures a lot as well, such as multiple Towers of London, so the match was a challenge for him as well. Nigel McGuinness had survived another day as Ring of Honor World Champion, but what toll did it take? 13 days later at Supercard of Honor 4, Nigel would finally be dethroned by former ECW World Champion Jerry Lynn. Nigel had actually beaten Lynn twice in ROH title matches, once in December 2008, and the second being a four-way match including Jimmy Jacobs and Tyler Black, the future Seth Rollins. I'm not saying this was the entire reason Lynn won the ROH title at this time, but many Ring of Honor fans that I remember seeing in their message board at the time had begun to link Jerry, who seemed to be at the latter end of his career, with Mickey Rourke's character in The Wrestler, Randy the Ram, which was released in January 2009. The Wrestler is a fairly harrowing film by director Darren Aronofsky about a former wrestling star seeking one last shot at glory. Not just from an aesthetic view, but scenes from that film were actually filmed at Ring of Honor shows, and ROH wrestlers were shown in the background of many backstage shots. I'd love to go into further detail about that film another time, but whether you believed any of that or not, Nigel simply couldn't go on further as champion without surgery, and so lost to Lynn that night. Around this time, Ring of Honor had launched its weekly television show, ROH on HDNet. I might be biased, but back in those days, ROH on HDNet was the show I most looked forward to every week. In the very unlikely event that anything I say here makes its way to anyone at Ring of Honor, please put these shows on Honor Club. They deserve to be rewatched. In the early days of that show, Nigel would appear while recovering from his injuries as an antagonist, and would wrestle a few matches, most notably his last one, where he would lose to Colt Cabana. In his final appearance on the show, he would apparently quit the company in a promo, leaving the ring and literally walking out the front door and walking off into the night. Remember how I said earlier that Nigel had tied the record for most world title defences ever? Well, Nigel's real last match in Ring of Honor would be against his biggest rival ever, as on September 26, 2009 at Glory by Honor 8, Nigel McGuinness and Bryan Danielson would have one final battle. Both were heading off to greater pastures, with Bryan heading to WWE and Nigel almost making it there. In a documentary that aired on the WWE Network in January 2019, Nigel notes that he failed his medical examination through being honest about his medical history, and thus wasn't hired. Bryan Danielson reveals in the same documentary that he lied to the WWE doctors about his history of concussions to get passed by them, which both launched and eventually hurt his career, given that for years he was forced to retire due to head injuries. Nigel, as a result, went to TNA and was repackaged under the name Desmond Wolfe, and was popular with the fans for some stellar matches he had with Kurt Angle, but for some reason not with management. Around this time, TNA implemented a weekly fan-voted poll to see who the number one contender would be, and every week Desmond Wolfe would win, despite whatever TNA booked to sway the fans in voting for anyone else. By the end of 2011, Nigel had retired as an in-ring competitor. He spent the next few years of his career as a commentator, an authority figure for Ring of Honor, initially met with criticism because of his English accent, but eventually becoming respected in that role. Respected enough that WWE would hire him as a commentator. He would make his debut alongside Michael Cole at the first United Kingdom Championship weekend, and the two had immediate chemistry that was sadly never revisited. When I started writing this video, Nigel was, to my knowledge, unemployed, having been released by WWE last October. In the time since, he returned to Ring of Honor as a commentator at the recent Supercard of Honor, and a few days later he was declared to be All Elite. I understand how some fans will see Nigel as a never man, having not wrestled for WWE. But I hope what you take away from this video is respect for the man who showed his capability to battle through agony, and whose in-ring legacy deserves to be remembered. Thank you for watching yet another wrestling channel. If you enjoyed this, please comment, like or subscribe.